Ryan Russell, and I'm the young adult and teaching pastor here at First Temple. And I'll be right outside these doors after the service. If you'd like to come by and say hello, I'd love to meet you and know your name. Today we are continuing in part 2 of our series called Everybody Counts, which we started just last week. And this series title, Everybody Counts, comes from a fictional book detective that was created by Michael Connelly. And in this book, this detective, when he was a young boy, his mother was brutally murdered. And so it inspired him to grow up one day and to become a detective. And so when he got the badge, he was finally able to go look at his mother's file and learn the details about her case. And much to his surprise, he discovered that his mother was a prostitute. And as a result of that, her case was actually never even investigated. They decided because she was that kind of woman that it wasn't even worth the time. Can you imagine how infuriating that must have been for this young detective? More than 20 years he'd been going about his life, and no one had even been looking for the man who killed his mother. And so right then and there, he determined that for the entirety of his career, every case that passed his desk would be investigated, no matter who the person was, no matter what they had done, and his catchphrase became, "Everybody counts or nobody counts." Well, when I came a few months ago, you may have been here the day that I introduced myself, I don't know, but if so, you know that I have a second job that I do when I'm not here, and it's genetic genealogy. And genetic genealogy is all about taking DNA and family trees and putting them together in order to find people. And so one of the really fun things that I get to do is work on some cold cases, actually really similar to the case of this detective's mother. So I thought just for fun, I would show you the pictures side by side of my two jobs. Here are my two headshots. There you go. So on the left, you have my headshot from the First Temple website. It's like, hey, how are you? I'm so glad they're here. I'd love to meet you. On the right side, this is from the United Data Connect website, and it's like, you can run, but I will find you. So in genetic genealogy, what happens is that the criminal will often leave behind his DNA at a crime scene, and so we're able to use that DNA and upload it to genealogy databases, and that gives us a list of who the criminal is related to. And from there, we can build family trees for those people, figure out how they can connect, and ultimately identify the criminal. And so when I heard this story, this fictional story about this detective and his mother, it actually reminded me of a real story that United Data Connect worked on just a few years ago, shortly before I joined the team. So let me introduce you to a woman named Tangi Sims. And so Tangi was a prostitute in Aurora, Colorado, who was brutally murdered in October of 1996 at just 25 years old. And so Tangi had a very hard life, even before this. She had been shot 5 times, which had left her partially paralyzed. And so she got around the streets of Aurora in a wheelchair. And yet, even so, she was a prostitute. Well, one night, one of her appointments sort of went sideways, and the man stabbed her 20 times to her death. The details are gruesome. I will spare you. But the next morning, Tangi's body was actually found in an alley, and it was thrown next to a dumpster. And she was laying there like garbage, just littered among all of the rest of the trash. They were not even given the respect to put her somewhere decent. Now, unfortunately for the killer, he left his DNA behind at the crime scene. His blood was found. Now, in 1996, there's nothing that you could do with DNA. But fast forward all the way to 2019, when our team at United Data Connect, again, before I got there, was able to take that DNA, and my boss, Joan, was able to use that sample to figure out who killed Tangi Sims. And she discovered that it was this man right here. His name was Wesley Backman. And it's hard to imagine how someone could do something as cruel like that, to treat someone like trash. Unfortunately, Wesley had already passed away more than a decade before in 2006. And so he never faced any time in court. He never faced any time in jail. And yet still there was some vindication for Tangi. Because by taking her case and by solving it, the team was saying that this woman may have meant nothing to Wesley Beckman, but she matters to us, and we're not going to let him have the last word about her. We may not approve of everything that Tangi had done, but Tangi still counts. Everybody counts. Last week, we started this series by looking at the idea from Genesis that we are created in the image of God. And Josh Flores Alvera was here preaching in this room, and he made this point, that being made in God's image means we have the ability, the capacity, and the potential to embody God's character. So God has put his image in you, and he has asked you to represent him in the world on his behalf. I was in the Classic venue last week, and here's the way we said it, that every human has intrinsic value, is worthy of dignity and respect, and reflects God's image. So no matter who you are, no matter what you have done, you are the image of God. This idea of the image of God, we should think of it a little bit like we're a mirror that God has created. And God has tasked us with reflecting himself into the world so that when people see us, they actually get a reflection of God and they have a little better picture about what he is like. And yet the reality is that all of us mess up, all of us sin. There are ways that we are not who we should be and we could be. And so instead, it's a little bit like we're a broken mirror. It's a mirror with cracks in it. That it still reflects the image of God, but the image is a little bit distorted. As we go on in the story of Scripture, we learn that Jesus in Colossians 1 was actually called the image of God. See, Jesus was the perfect and true reflection of what God is like. And so the idea is that if we, as broken reflections and images, will attach ourselves to Jesus, the perfect and true image of God, then he can heal the cracks in our mirror slowly over time so that we become more and more like him and that we once again start to reflect the image of God more faithfully like we were originally created to do. This is what it means to be God's image. Well, today we're going to continue with this theme by looking in the book of Psalms. Psalm 139 is what we're going to be looking at today. So this was a favorite psalm of mine growing up. Whenever I would go through hard times in life, I would often turn to this psalm. So many times that eventually I just said, well, why don't I just memorize it? And so I did when I was in high school, and it became really important to me. It got me through some seasons that were challenging in life. And I think that the reason that I love this psalm so much is because how deeply personal it is. It describes God's attention to us in our lives. It describes his involvement in our life. It describes how much we matter and count to God, and it invites us into a relationship with him. So let's read together Psalm 139. O Lord, you have searched me and you know me. You know when I sit and when I rise. You perceive my thoughts from afar. You discern my going out and my lying down. You are familiar with all my ways. Before a word is on my tongue, you know it completely, O Lord. You hem me in behind and before. You have laid your hand upon me. Such knowledge is too wonderful for me, too lofty for me to attain. Where can I go from your spirit? Where can I flee from your presence? If I go to the heavens, you are there. If I make my bed in the depths, you are there. If I rise on the wings of the dawn, if I settle on the far side of the sea, even there your hand will guide me. Your right hand will hold me fast. If I say, surely the darkness will hide me and the light become night around me, even the darkness will not be dark to you. The night will shine like the day, for darkness is as light to you. For you created my inmost being. You knit me together in my mother's womb. I praise you because I am fearfully and wonderfully made. Your works are wonderful. I know that full well. My frame was not hidden from you when I was made in the secret place. When I was woven together in the depths of the earth, your eyes saw my unformed body. All the days ordained for me were written in your book before one of them came to be. How precious to me are your thoughts, O God. How vast is the sum of them. Were I to count them, they would outnumber the grains of the sand. And when I awake, I'm still with you. If only you would slay the wicked, O God. Away from me, you bloodthirsty men. They speak of you with evil intent. Your adversaries misuse your name. Do I not hate those who hate you, O Lord, and abhor those who rise up against you? I have nothing but hatred for them. I count them my enemies. Search me, O God, and know my heart. Test me and know my anxious thoughts. See if there is any offensive way in me, and lead me in the way of the everlasting. Isn't that a beautiful psalm? I wonder if you've ever heard of the concept of a parasocial relationship. Now, it sounds kind of complicated and technical, but I promise you are familiar with this. A parasocial relationship is a one-way relationship where you feel like you know somebody. Maybe it's somebody famous like a celebrity or an athlete, an author, an artist, a podcaster, and you're so familiar with them, you've observed them for such a long enough time, that maybe you know details about their personal life that you feel like you know them, but it's a one-way relationship because they don't even know that you exist. This is a parasocial relationship, and in a social media age, we have these relationships all the time, right? It's very common. Well, the one parasocial relationship that's more recent to me in my own life is with Victor Wembanyama. Victor Wembanyama. All right, so Victor was the number one pick in the NBA draft just a couple of months ago, back in June, by my favorite team, the San Antonio Spurs. All right? Yeah, go Spurs, go. All right. So, in my lifetime, we've had some good days as a Spurs fan. We've got 5 rings, to give thanks for. And yet the last 5 years have been really rough. It has been very hard to watch, if I'm honest. So bad that we got the number one pick, right? And yet we get Victor Wembanyama. Now, Victor, I'm really excited about this because he is being touted as the best basketball prospect since at least LeBron James, but some people are saying maybe the best basketball prospect ever, okay? Now, notice how tall he is in this picture. This is Adam Silver standing next to him, the NBA commissioner. Adam Silver is 6'3". So Victor is 7'4". He has an 8-foot wingspan, okay? He's 19 years old. He's from France, and he is going to be incredible, all right? So I'm ready for a amazing decade plus of San Antonio Spurs basketball, y'all. The future is bright. So jump on the bandwagon now. I'm just going to go ahead and invite you, all right? It's going to get crowded later, but there's room now, so jump on board. So anyway, the reason that this is a parasocial relationship for me is that it's a one-way relationship, right? You see, I find that every now and then, every 2 or 3 days or so, I find myself thinking about Victor. I find myself wondering how he's, liking Texas so far. How's San Antonio? It's kind of hot down there. Probably a lot hotter than Paris, all right? I find myself wondering how many points he's going to score on opening night on October 25th. 20, 30? Is he going to get to 40? What's it going to be? I find myself wondering dumb things like, I wonder if he's found any good breakfast tacos in San Antonio. How's Victor doing? And y'all, the sad part that I'm really still trying to wrestle with, and I'm not sure I'm ready to accept it yet, but maybe you can help me today. The sad part that I have to wrap my mind around is that Victor is not thinking about me. Right? When he lays in bed at night, he's not saying, man, how's Ryan doing? How's that sermon coming along for Sunday? I wonder how it's coming. I wonder if he's found any good breakfast tacos ever since he moved to Temple. I wonder if he has. It's not happening. Now, Victor, if I'm wrong and you're watching this on our live stream, or maybe later, would love to hear from you. We're in a gym right here, actually, so we can put down the goal, come up to Temple, we'll play a game of horse. It'll be great. No dunking, all right, But we'd love to hear from you, so come on up, all right, if you're listening. Guys, I don't think he's listening. I think that's probably a pipe dream, all right? Because you see, in a parasocial relationship, it's implied that the person who's being admired, in this case, Victor, is the more important person, right? And yet that's what's so interesting about Psalm 139. Between us and between God. There's no question that God is way, way, way more important. And what this psalm tells us is that God is paying attention to us. And who are we to have his attention? And yet the God of the universe, who sees all, knows all, the good and the bad, is paying attention to you and to me. It's backwards. We're going to zoom in on verses 13 through 18 in this passage. And it's going to give us three images that we can wrap our minds around. First of all, of a quilt. Secondly, of sand. And finally, of a book. We're going to think about how carefully God created you, like a quilt. How often God thinks of you, sand. And how interested God is in your life, is a book. So let's go one by one. First of all, the quilt. This comes to us from verse 13 in the psalm. Let's read it again. It says, "For you created my inmost being. You knit me together in my mother's womb." So I brought a little something with me here today. This is a quilt that our friend Robin, who lives in Georgia, made for our family around the time that Griffin was born. It's this beautiful quilt, and if you can see it, you can tell that the theme is birds. So Rachel, my wife, loves birds, and so Robin sent us a text, and she said, "Hey, would you tell me, I'm making you a quilt, would you tell me your top 5 favorite birds?" And it took Rachel about 5 seconds to figure that out. She rattled off these species that I've never heard of, okay? In fact, here's one on the back. This is, apparently it's called a kakapo. It is a New Zealand bird. And how she knew this, I have no idea, but she knows all things birds. And it is a parrot that walks around on the ground out in the wild, and it's nocturnal in New Zealand. So there you go. You learned something new today, the kakapo. When they got to me and they said, "Ryan, what are your 5 favorite birds?" I was like, "I like the blue ones, you know." That's about all I got. So we got some bluebirds on here, you know. That's exciting. But, you know, when I looked at this quilt, it amazed me because of the amazing detail, right, that went into it. The stitching is so particular, and it's so handmade. There's not another gift like this anywhere else in the world. There's only one of these. We live in a world today where we just buy gifts for each other on Amazon. We send the link, you put it in your cart, you know, it's done, and 300 other people have that same gift. This is one of a kind. And it amazes me how long Robin took to make this quilt, that the detail was so carefully done. Every single inch of it was you know, particular and personal. And she took care and time and attention to make it work. And so the psalmist here uses this image of that's what God was doing for us when we were in the womb, that he was knitting us together. I get this picture in my mind of God just sitting in a big rocking chair for 9 months, just working on us, knitting us together, piece by piece. And it's amazing because usually when we think of a child in the womb, we think of God as just kind of in the sky, just watching, observing, letting natural processes, you know, take place, and they are. But here, this passage invites us to see God as actively involved in the act of creation, that you are handmade, that God made you the way that you did on purpose, that just like that quilt, there is no detail that is accidental. Strategic and intentional design was on purpose. Wow. You know, a lot of us have parts about ourselves that we wish we could change. Sometimes that's our looks or our personality or just something that makes us stick out from everyone else. But this verse challenges us to think of those things not as mistakes, but actually as God's design. We may be confused why we are how we are, but this verse makes us think that perhaps God can use even those parts of me for a bigger purpose. He has handmade you, every detail on purpose, exactly the way that he wanted you to be, like a quilt. Amazing. The second image that we get in this passage is the image of sand. Recently, my son Griffin has a birthday coming up in October, and so someone asked us if they could get us a sandbox for our backyard for Griffin's birthday. Guys, we declined. And you know why. Sand gets literally everywhere, right? I mean, if you pick up a handful of sand, you get 10,000 grains right in your palm. I can think of 10,000 places in my house that sand would have been. That's just Monday, all right? And so this passage equates God's relationship to us like sand. Look at verse 17 and 18 again. He writes, "How precious to me are your thoughts, O God. How vast is the sum of them. Were I to count them, they would outnumber the grains of the sand." I wonder if you've ever thought about the fact that God thinks about you. Not just every now and then when it comes to his mind, that God actively thinks about you. In fact, God has had more thoughts about you than the grains of the sand. Now, I did a little Google research. How many grains of sand are in the world? A lot, y'all. In fact, the number is 7.5 sextillion. And then I Googled, what is sextillion? And I learned that it goes million, billion, trillion, quadrillion, quintillion, sextillion. There you go. That's a lot of zeros. Am I right? So a sextillion is a trillion billions, y'all. A trillion billion grains of sand in the world. Amazing. What this passage is telling us is that God has had more thoughts about you than that. That's a lot of zeros, all right? And what that tells me is that God has had more thoughts about you than you've had about yourself. He's so deeply familiar with you. He knows your whereabouts. He knows your words before they ever come on your tongue. He knows your thoughts, your feelings, your tendencies. He knows it all. When you have that light bulb moment where you realize something about yourself, God already knew that long, long, long ago. And it's not just that God knows these facts like he's collecting them as if he's like Big Brother who has a file, collecting all the data on us stored somewhere, right? It's implied that he cares, that's why he thinks about us, is that he's fascinated by you and by me. He's obsessed because he created us and he loves us and he's interested. His thoughts outnumber the grains of the sand. So quilt of sand. And then the last image that we're given here is the image of a book. Psalm 139 verse 6 says, "All the days ordained for me were written in your book before one of them came to be." So here we get this image of God having a book that is just about us. And man, it must be a long book with a lot of pages because every moment of your life recorded there. There's a page with tomorrow's date on it, August 28th, 2023. And what's currently unknown to you, but will become known tomorrow, is already known to God. Now, my interpretation of this is it's not that your days are scripted and they lack meaning. It's that God sees into the future and he knows all of it. There are no surprises to him. And yet as we go through our days, they still are meaningful. And so the thing that's totally throwing you off in your life right now, that you did not see coming and you're not really even sure how you're going to keep stepping forward, that thing is not a surprise to God. He had a page on it. And you know what? He has a page on how it's going to resolve as well. And that ought to provide us a lot of comfort. Recently, I met someone in person and I said, "Hey, I've heard that name before. Did you write this book?" And next thing I knew, I was meeting the author of a book that I had read several years ago. And his wife was right there with him and she said, "Hey, somebody actually read one of your books, And I think in that moment, he felt honored that, wow, people are indeed reading my work. Like it's doing something out there in the world. Well, flip that on its head for a second. It's that God has read your book. He's familiar with every single page. Wow, that ought to make us feel really, really important. And it ought to make us realize that we count. We're like a quilt that God has woven together. God's thoughts of us outnumber the grains of the sand. And he holds a book where all of our days are written. If Victor Wembanyama was watching this sermon somehow, and Victor, I'm still holding out that hope, man, reach out. If he sent me a message, I would be beside myself. because I'm watching Victor. Why in the world would Victor be watching me, right? How crazy would that be? And yet, as crazy as it would be, it pales in comparison to how amazing it is that the God of the universe would pay even the slightest attention to us. And yet we're told here that he doesn't just pay attention to us, he handmade us. He's constantly thinking about us. He's infinitely interested in our lives, even though he knows all the details, all the secrets out in the open about who we are, even still. And guys, when I think about this, it honestly blows my mind. And I'm just drawn into in awe and worship of who God is, that he would care to think of me. This Psalm 139 has a few implications too of how we should understand ourselves. The first one is it impacts us on the level of self-worth. That we ought to think, wow, maybe I really am valuable. Maybe I count. In fact, if I matter that much to God, then maybe I should start mattering to me too. It should help us rethink our self-worth. The second thing is it should help us think about self-love. That we ought to move from tolerating ourselves to really actually loving ourselves. Now, self-love doesn't mean that we're perfect as we are. No, we are all broken images of God that need to be repaired by Jesus, the true image of God, right? But self-love is about accepting the parts of us that we can't control. It even might mean forgiving ourselves for the things that we wish we could undo, but that we know that we can't. And I know a lot of us struggle with this today. Either the idea of forgiving ourselves or even thinking positive thoughts about ourselves. And yet this psalm challenges us to reason, if Jesus loved me enough to die for me, then maybe I ought to work on loving myself too. So we have self-worth, self-love, and then finally we're encouraged to think about self-surrender. See, Psalm 139 ends in sort of an unexpected way. David has just spent 22 verses writing about how deeply and intimately God knows every detail of his life. And then he writes this, verse 23. Search me, O God, and know my heart. Test me and know my anxious thoughts. If God knows everything, where you go, what you do, what you say, all the details, all the thoughts, why would David ask God to search him? What is left to search? He goes on to say, see if there is any offensive way in me, and lead me in the way everlasting. Now, David does not need to give God permission to see something that he does not already see. But what he's doing is he's opening up his life and saying, God, I want you to have control. I want you to do a work of transformation in me. I'm not going to hold myself back anymore. I want to be in cooperation and participation with the work that you want to do in my life. God, I surrender to the one who knows me, who sees me, who believes in me, and who loves me. And so today, as we wrestle with the reality that God handmade us, he thinks about us, he's infinitely interested in our lives, I wonder if we can surrender to him in the same way. Let's pray. God, we love you. We're reminded today of that mind-blowing fact that we count to you. God, I'm not sure how we count much more than a grain of sand, just one. And yet, we're on your mind. And so, Lord, I pray that today we would be reminded of the fact that we do matter to you and hopefully to ourselves as well. Would you do that work of transformation in our lives as we surrender ourselves to you? In your name we pray. Amen.